Welcome to Hanukkah to Christmas, a celebration of light. Behind me is Alexander the Great. He's the son of Philip of Macedon, who was a great leader in the ancient world. He didn't live a long life, however, and his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. And Alexander loved his image. I mean, you see it here, you see it in mosaics, you see it on coins. And when Alexander died, his kingdom was divided among these 4 generals. This is actually talked about in the book of Daniel. And 2 of these generals are quickly kind of fall out of power, and 2 become very powerful. And this leads us then into the world of Alexander, and you can see what the Mediterranean world looked like at that time. So of course, here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's the Red Sea, and then here's the Dead Sea. So Israel is in the middle. You have the Ptolemies down in Egypt. You have the Seleucids up in Syria. In between, the Israelites are caught in a tug of war between these very, very powerful forces that both want to control them. And that leads us into the actual story of Hanukkah. We have next to this several coins that pertain to our story. Most importantly, we have the coin of Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And he rules for about a 10-year period from 175 to 164 BC, and he does something extremely interesting that changes human history. In the year 167, he decides that he is going to force those within his kingdom, because now he's exercised his hegemony over Israel. He's going to force these people to convert to paganism. He goes to Jerusalem. He erects a statue of Baal Shaman, or Zeus, in the temple itself. He sacrifices a pig on the altar in Jerusalem, defiling it, and he declares himself as God manifest. That's what Epiphanes means. So it's Theos Epiphaneos, and that's the inscription on this coin. Theos Epiphaneos, God manifest. These 3 things form the abomination of desolation. He prohibits circumcision, he prohibits Sabbath observance, and he prohibits the study of Torah. He sends his own statue to each city throughout Judea, and when he does that, he requires people to bow down and worship or burn incense, pay homage to his statue. In other words, he is going to totally root out biblical Judaism. But when he comes to this city, Modein, down in the rolling hills leading up to Jerusalem, there's a family known as the Hasmoneans, and they're gathered very likely in this spot. This is the oldest synagogue from the biblical world. It dates to the 2nd century BC from the city of Modein, and this is where the story takes place. So they're gathered at Modein, very likely in this synagogue. And the representative of Antiochus Epiphanes brings that statue, and an elderly man goes forward to worship it. Mattathias, the patriarch of the family, draws his sword and he runs the man through. He also kills an official of the king. And he lets out this cry, "All who are zealous for the God of Israel, follow me." He and his 5 sons lead a contingency up into the Bethel Hills, and this sets off the 3.5-year war known as the Maccabean Revolt. Through God's help, eventually they prevail. The oldest son's name is Judas. Judas has Monea, but he fights like a hammer, and so his nickname becomes Maccabee, the Hebrew word for hammer. And when they come into Jerusalem, what do they find? The temple has been defiled. There's pig's blood on the altar. All the sacred oil that's been stamped with the seal of the high priest has been destroyed, except for 1 vial, which they find hidden in sort of a recess. And they need to rededicate the temple, so they disassemble the old altar, they build a new altar, and they take this 1 vial of oil, and with their menorah, the sacred lampstand that resides in the temple that represents the light of God, they want to rededicate. So they decide that they're going to rededicate the temple because of the 8-day celebration that has been missed. They're going to do it for 8 days, but they only have enough oil for 1 day. They decide that they're going to do it for 1 day and then just trust God that they're going to find more oil. And so a miracle occurs. The oil doesn't run out, it keeps burning. and it lasts for 8 days. And this then becomes the miracle of Hanukkah. The word Hanukkah in Hebrew means dedication. So Jesus then celebrates the feast of Hanukkah in John chapter 10. This is the most common coin that we excavate. At our excavations 10 miles north of Jerusalem, we found 1,322 coins. Half of them were this coin. It's often referred to as the widow's mite. It's the most common coin that there is. And there's a star on this coin. This is the Numbers 24 prophecy, the Balaam prophecy of a Messiah who was going to come and redeem Israel, because it's a constant reminder that a star is going to lead them to the Messiah. The menorah itself is pictured on the Arch of Titus in Rome. The treasures and the slaves from Jerusalem after its destruction in AD 70 are portrayed on the Arch of Titus, and prominently displayed is the temple menorah. So we have a good idea what it looks like. You also see the first century depiction from the Magdala stone of the temple menorah or lamp, and then again a close-up of the menorah motif on this lamp. We often grew up reading that there was no room for them in the inn. So Joseph had brought Mary, who was large with child, and they had traveled all the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of the census. Well, let's unpack that just a little bit. We have some interesting Greek words, in specifically the word kataluma and the word pandakion. Now, when it says there was no room for them in the inn, this is the word kataluma. And we see that word used by Luke elsewhere in his gospel when he says to the disciples, when you come into Jerusalem, you will find a man carrying a jar of water. Follow him and he will lead you to the kataluma, which is the upper room in a first century house. And this is a first century house which my team excavated. And you can see that there is an upper room here. So when we read the text this way, there was no room in the kataluma. In other words, that wasn't the ideal place to give birth. We don't want a woman in labor climbing those stairs, and then they're going to have people coming and going and all the women helping with this birth process. But instead, what they do is they come down on the first floor where the animals are, which is part of a first century house, is a barn. They clean this area out, and it's there that Mary gives birth to Jesus. And you can see here this replica of a manger, and mangers were made out of stone in the biblical world. And you can see where the animals would feed. They clean this out, and then after giving birth, the baby is wrapped in swaddling clothes, and then this becomes the bassinet or the manger. Now, the Greek word pandakion is the word used by Luke in chapter 10 of his gospel when he's telling us the story of the Good Samaritan. So Luke knows exactly what a pandakion is. He knows what an innkeeper is also. So if he had meant to use that word, pandakion, he would have used it in the nativity narrative. Instead, he uses the word kataluma, indicating it's in an upper room. So in reality, Jesus was born surrounded by family, surrounded by friends, in a loving environment of a first century home. Were there animals present, as the Bible says? Yes, of course. This is where those animals live. Were shepherds nearby? Certainly they were. So this gives us the archaeological background of the nativity story that sets it into a real life context. We started talking about Hanukkah, and now we've made our way all the way around to Christmas. We talked about the birth of Christ, and the tragedy of the Christmas story is, of course, the massacre of the innocents. If Jesus is the protagonist of the story, clearly Herod the Great is the antagonist. He seeks to kill the babies in Bethlehem in hopes of snuffing out the Messiah who is going to save Israel and save the world. So we read about this in Matthew 2:16, and sometimes we picture that there are hundreds or maybe thousands of baby boys that are slaughtered, and this is simply not the case. Bethlehem is a little hamlet at this point, maybe a population of 300 or 400, so maybe 12 to 15 babies, toddlers, 2 and under, baby boys, 2 and under, that were slaughtered by Herod's men. This is horrific. Herod was a megalomaniac. But of course, by this point, he had already killed his own sons out of paranoia that they were going to try to usurp his power. So once one kills his own children, then why would he have any remorse about killing these peasants in Bethlehem? So it's likely that Herod was at one of his fortresses called Herodium, which is about 2 miles from Bethlehem and perches over Bethlehem looking down on it. If Herod was there when he gave the order, then he likely heard the screams and saw the horrific results of these slaughtered babies in Bethlehem. Christmas developed over time, and one of the key figures was St. Nicholas. Now, St. Nicholas dates to the 3rd century, so very early in the Christian era, and he was a man of great generosity. He took his wealth, he gave it to others. He was one known for giving gifts. He was actually present at the Council of Nicaea, the first great Christian council, was a key player there. And so St. Nicholas was celebrated as an example of generosity. Since Hanukkah was related to December the 25th, and St. Nicholas was this great example of generosity, later many groups began to celebrate the idea of St. Nicholas as one who would give gifts, the example that God gives of giving his great gift to us, and it's the example that we give when we exchange gifts at Christmas time, of remembering the miracle of December 25th, of the lighting of the oil, the miracle of light, and then how this is manifested today as we exchange gifts to one another, and we remember, as Jesus said, I am the light of the world. I have the coin of Caesar Augustus, mentioned here in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, in the days of Caesar Augustus. This reminds us that we're talking in the gospel story about real people, real places, and real events. The shepherds were the lowest rung of society. The wise men were the highest rung. Jesus came for both the shepherd and the wise men. And that's the story of Hanukkah to Christmas. I want to give you a sneak preview of our menorah that just arrived, thanks to TBS student Roger Pais for constructing this for us. These are the lamps we're going to be lighting each night of Hanukkah. These are actual lamps from the time period. They have not been lit since the biblical period, and we're going to be lighting them each night. We want you guys to be a part of this great celebration from Hanukkah to Christmas, a celebration of light.